In July of the year 1518, residents of the city of Strasbourg were struck by a sudden and uncontrollable urge to dance. By August, the dancing epidemic had claimed as many as 400 victims. Local physicians blamed it on hot blood and suggested that the afflicted simply gyrate the fever away. The epidemic was finally brought under control in September, but by then, a lot more dancers had died from strokes and heart attacks. Unbelievable, right? But this dancing epidemic is well documented in 16th century historical records. Welcome to The Why in History. I am Ajay Kaul, and today we look at the bizarre, the extraordinary, the unbelievable, and many times comical events and incidents from history, some of which were simply government operations. In December of 1944, in the final months of World War II, a Japanese lieutenant named Hiroo Onoda was stationed in Lubang, a tiny island in the Philippines. Within weeks of his arrival, a US attack forced the Japanese combatants into the jungle. But unlike most of his comrades, Onoda remained hidden on the island for 30 years. The Japanese government declared him dead in 1959, but actually, he was alive and committed to a secret mission that had instructed him to hold the island until the Imperial Army's return. For 30 years, he was convinced that the war had never ended. Most of the Japanese troops on the island either withdrew or surrendered to the oncoming American forces. But Onoda and a few of his fellow combatants hid in the jungles, and they dismissed messages saying that the war was over. The war was actually soon over, and the leaflets that were dropped on Lubang to inform stragglers of Japan's surrender on 15 August 1945 were dismissed as fakes by Onoda and 3 remaining servicemen who stood by him. They remained hidden in the wilderness, among the stinging ants and snakes, living on a diet of banana skins, coconuts, and stolen rice, still convinced that the enemy was trying to starve them out. Search parties tried to find them out, but Onoda assumed them to be Japanese prisoners, forced against their will. Incidentally, the World War II was soon followed by the Korean War in that area between 1950 and 53. So the jets flying overhead during the Korean War were thought to be Japanese counteroffensive. His last remaining fellow combatant, Kinshichi Kozuka, was killed by shots fired by the local police in October of 1972. But Onoda remained on the island, alone for another 18 months. Finally, Onoda had a chance encounter with a Japanese explorer named Norio Suzuki, who was shocked to find him there. Suzuki tried to convince him to return, but Onoda laid a condition for his return. If Suzuki could bring Onoda's commanding officer to Lubang with direct orders to lay down arms, he would comply. Suzuki was able to get Onoda's commanding officer to travel to Lubang in March of 1974. The commanding officer met him and formally released him from his military duties. In his battered old army uniform, Onoda handed over his sword nearly 30 years after Japanese surrender. When he returned to Japan in 1974, Onoda received a hero's welcome, being the last native Japanese soldier to return home from the war. His memoir was published soon after and became a bestseller, leading to a 3-hour movie, Onoda, 10,000 Nights in the Jungle, which is currently available on Prime Video. From the soldier who returned to the Prime Minister who never returned. On December 17, 1967, Australian Prime Minister Harold Holt, stepped into the surf at Cheviot Beach near Melbourne, Australia, never to be seen again. Before his disappearance, Holt had been Australia's Prime Minister for approximately 2 years. And within this 2-year span, he had had quite a few achievements, which included switching Australia's currency to the dollar and a landmark 1967 national referendum, which paved the way for Indigenous Australians to finally be counted among the country's population. And he built a close personal friendship with the then US President Lyndon B. Johnson, famously declaring at the White House during his visit that he was all the way with LBJ. Holt was holidaying in that region, having finished his cabinet meetings a few days earlier, and on December 17, 1967, he decided to head to the local beach, which was close to the holiday house he owned at Portsea on the Victorian coast. The tide was unusually high, with a strong undercurrent when Holt decided to go for a swim at the beach. His friends and family were around, and they continued watching him while he swam deeper into the sea. And suddenly, when they could no longer spot him, they raised the alarm. About 300 people, who included amateur sleuths, police, and the Australian Army, descended upon the beach immediately after the alarm was raised in an attempt to find him. The search continued for approximately 3 weeks before being called off. He just couldn't be found. Holt was a keen swimmer and spearfisher, and he practiced holding his breath during Parliament so he could dive deeper during his frequent snorkeling trips. So drowning did not seem to be a plausible reason for his disappearance. However, he was not medically fit, and his doctor had advised him against swimming. But if he drowned, his body should have been found. And this mystery gave rise to a lot of conspiracy theories, which included that he had committed suicide, distraught over his marriage and worn out from his job. However, in 1983, 16 years after his disappearance, Anthony Gray, an award-winning British journalist, published a sensational book, The Prime Minister Was a Spy. In that book, he claimed that Holt was a spy for Communist China, and he had not drowned, but had been picked by a submarine and lived out the rest of his life in Beijing. And the source of his information was Australian Navy Commander Ronald Titcomb, who said that he was given this information during a series of meetings with the Chinese officials in Iraq in 1973. It was contended that Holt had been recruited while he was a student at the Queen's College in Melbourne in July of 1929 and had supplied information to the nationalist government of Chiang Kai-shek and subsequently changed his allegiance to the Chinese. This theory was debunked, though, on the basis that the choppy waters of Cheviot Beach would be unsuitable for a submarine rescue. And then his wife Zara said Holt just did not like Chinese food. About 35 years prior to the embarrassment of losing a prime minister, Australia was the subject of ridicule across the globe for losing a war against wildlife, specifically the emus. The Australian emus routinely migrate to the west coast in search of food and water. But after World War I, this started becoming a problem. Many World War I veterans in Australia had been given land in Western Australia to produce wheat. That land wasn't great for agriculture for starters, and due to the worldwide economic depression, the wheat prices were at historic lows. So when 20,000 emus turned up in the towns of Chandler and Walgulan and started destroying crops and damaging the fences designed to keep rabbits away, drastic measures were called for. The farmers appealed to the authorities for assistance, And the government responded by sending in the Royal Australian Artillery, armed with 2 Levi's light machine guns. Never underestimate the intelligence and survival skills of the animal species. So when the guns were trained on flocks of emus, the emus responded by breaking up into small groups and scattering in all directions. And that made it impossible to kill them en masse as was intended. 2 days later, on November 4, 1932, the soldiers changed tactics and prepared an ambush at a nearby dam. They waited as a battalion of around 1,000 emus approached the water, and at virtually point-blank range, the Australians opened fire. But after a few rounds, the machine guns jammed, and the emus managed to escape with relatively few casualties. The soldiers tried another tactic, chasing the emus on a truck and firing the machine gun from the back of the truck. But this proved ineffective because the ground was too rough for the truck, and the emus were super fast on this rough ground. By November 8, 1932, news reports had widely publicized that the emus had won the Emu War. Members of the Australian House of Representatives joked that if anyone deserved medals from the conflict, it was the emus who had won every round. The soldiers withdrew on November 8, 1932, but the farmers demanded their return. Between November 12 and December 10, the returned soldiers reported that 986 emus were killed, and about 2,500 later died of their injuries. But this number was too small to make any dent in the population of the emus. The primary reason for the failure of this operation was that the Australian soldiers did not realize that one emu in each group served as a lookout to warn the others, giving them time to escape. Ultimately, the emus were considered the victors in the Emu War. Though Australia failed in its campaign against wildlife, almost 25 years later, China emerged successful, but it created a huge ecological disaster in the process. I'm talking about the Four Pests campaign between 1958 and 1962 in Communist China as part of Mao Zedong's Great Leap Forward. The campaign was initiated as a move towards public hygiene by eliminating 4 pests, that is, the mosquitoes, rodents, flies, and tree sparrows. Mosquitoes, rodents, and flies were identified because of their role in spreading malaria, typhoid, and the plague. The sparrows were included in the list because they consumed rice and other seeds from agricultural fields. The Chinese citizens were asked to act together against these pests, and the government published posters illustrating the need for fly swatters, drums, gongs, and guns as tools in the fight for improved public health. And the citizens did respond. But sparrows received a large portion of this attention, as citizens were encouraged to make noise with pots, pans, and drums, which scared the sparrows and resulted in them falling from the sky from exhaustion. The nests were torn apart, eggs broken, and the fledglings killed. Schools, work groups, and government agencies were given accolades based on the number of pests killed. And as a result of this campaign, nearly 1 billion sparrows were killed in China, rendering the sparrow virtually extinct. Overall, the Four Pests campaign was a huge success, but it created a massive ecological disaster. It turned out that the sparrows ingested more insects than grains, and as the sparrows got extinct, the insect population across China grew exponentially. Particularly the locusts, which started to thrive on the food grains that were intended for human consumption.
partly due to other policies of the administration, and a lot due to this Four Pests campaign, crop production witnessed a massive decline, worsening the famine that had already engulfed China. And by the time the famine was over, between 15 and 36 million Chinese had died due to starvation.
Meanwhile, in the neighboring North Korea, tensions were running high between North and South Korea around August of 1976. And on August 18, 1976, two U.S. Army officers serving in the United Nations Command at the Joint Security Area between North and South Korea were murdered in an unprovoked attack by North Koreans while they were attempting to prune a tree. The Joint Security Area, or JSA, often referred to as the Truce Village or Panmunjom, is the only portion in the Korean DMZ where North and South Korean forces stand face to face. The JSA is used by the two Koreas for diplomatic engagements, and it was here that President Trump stepped into North Korea, becoming the first US leader to do so. In early spring of 1976, the North Korean government was broadcasting daily propaganda claiming the US was committing aggression and threatening peace. On the 5th of August 1976, there was a shooting between North and South Korean soldiers in the DMZ, and after that, the North Koreans released a memo claiming the US was introducing new weapons in the Korean Peninsula to instigate a war. The US side received a report that assessed that the North Koreans were trying to influence the upcoming American presidential elections, hoping that a few casualties in the peninsula would cause the American public to oppose the continued presence of US troops on the peninsula. And in this tense atmosphere, on August 18, a small group of US and South Korean troops set out on a mission to cut back a tree in the Joint Security Area. The tree was obstructing the view from a nearby observation tower, so it was a routine operation. About 15 North Korean soldiers approached the group and demanded that they stop trimming the tree. When the US and South Korean group refused, the North Koreans attacked them with crowbars, clubs, and axes, which were being used to cut the tree. 2 US Army officers were killed, and 4 US soldiers and 4 South Korean soldiers were wounded. When the news reached Washington, President Gerald Ford asked his advisors to come up with the best response. The group came back with their recommendation the following day, and it was that the US and South Korean forces should continue and cut down the tree entirely. The question was whether they should follow a diplomatic route and inform the North Koreans, or should they cut the tree without warning, using the maximum number of men to do so, thereby going for a display of force. The second option was picked, and the group also asked President Ford for approval to conduct a B-52 flyover at the same time as the tree was being cut to further display the US military might. Subsequently, the plan was upgraded to move a naval task force from the Sea of Japan, fly in a few fighter jets from Idaho, and even bomb North Korean barracks. Just a reminder, all this preparation to cut a tree. 3 days later, on August 21, 1976, Operation Paul Bunyan was launched. A convoy of 23 American and South Korean vehicles with chainsaws arrived at the tree to cut it down. And providing a solid backup to this group were 110 troops with M16 rifles and M79 grenade launchers, 27 helicopters, 3 B-52 bombers, aircraft carrier USS Midway, and nuclear-capable strategic bombers circulating overhead. after 42 minutes, the tree, which was a poplar, was brought down. This time, the North Koreans watched from a distance, not moving an inch. The nearby North Korea Peace Museum now houses the axe and the axe handle that was used in this incident. And on that note, we end this section of the program. On to the quiz section. Question from the previous episode. Which three presidents won the presidency polling more than 500 electoral votes? FDR in 1936, Richard Nixon in 1972, and Ronald Reagan in 1984 won the presidency polling more than 500 electoral votes. So the answer is C, FDR, Nixon, and Reagan. Question for the current episode. The painting of which famous 20th century painter that adorned the North Korea Peace Museum was covered up because the painter was a communist? Was it A, Pablo Picasso, B, Frida Kahlo, C, Andy Warhol, or D, Salvador Dali? Once again, the painting of which famous 20th century painter that adorned the North Korea Peace Museum was covered up because the painter was a communist? A, Pablo Picasso, B, Frida Kahlo, C, Andy Warhol, or D, Salvador Dali? The answer will be provided in the next episode. That's all we have in the current episode. We now take a break for the holidays, and the next episode will air on January the 4th, 2025. That episode will cover part 3 of the US presidential elections history from World War II to the present day. Till then, have a wonderful holiday season and a happy new year. And keep exploring the why in history.